The first time Garval, a seasoned Virak warrior, saw a human sit at the back of the transport, he dismissed it as nothing more than fear. He didn't say anything at the time, but the sight of those strange, soft-looking beings settling into the rear seats sparked an old, familiar contempt in him. It wasn't just annoyance. No, it was something deeper, something that reached into the bones of a warrior who'd spent decades earning his place at the front of every battle. In his world, positioning meant everything. You didn't just sit somewhere you claimed it. The strongest went first. The front was for the bold. So, when the humans quietly took their usual place in the back, Garval interpreted it through the lens of his own culture: cowardice. Not that he could blame them, really. The galaxy was full of weak species who were better suited for observation than action. But the humans weren't observers. At least, that's not what the Concord records claimed. They were new to the galactic scene, maybe 30, 40 standard years into their membership, but their dossier was cluttered with skirmishes, successful extractions, and battles that ended faster than analysts could track. Still, he hadn't seen them fight, not with his own eyes. And what you saw, what you felt in the field, that's what mattered. Reports were just words, often exaggerated, flawed. Human accomplishments could have been the result of technology, or maybe they'd just gotten lucky in a few chaotic engagements. But their behavior didn't match warriors, not in Garval's eyes. Their uniforms were always clean, their posture too relaxed. They whispered in their own language, too soft to understand, too private to ignore. That quiet communication put Garval on edge more than open hostility ever could. He sat in the second row of the transport that day, just behind the towering Virak High Warlord and his advisors. Their presence alone took up most of the forward section, their hulking frames resting heavily in reinforced seats. Behind them sat the Drari beings clad in thick carapace armor, some of whom even wore their war trophies as decoration. They, too, believed in the supremacy of the front. Further back were the Zoloth, a spindly, multi-jointed species, with sharp clicking voices that filled the middle rows with an unsettling rhythm. And then, in the very back, were the humans, always in the back. Garval's crimson eyes flicked to them again. One of them, Sergeant Nolan, according to the manifest, was leaning back with his boots tucked under the seat in front of him, arms loosely crossed, expression unreadable. Garval couldn't take it anymore. He shifted slightly in his seat, metal groaning under his weight, and turned just enough to address the human directly. "Is it cowardice?" he asked, voice low and gravelly, "that keeps your kind in the rear?" Nolan looked up lazily, exhaled through his nose, and shrugged. "Just habit," he said. Garval blinked. That was it? No explanation? No defense? "Habit," Garval repeated, scoffing. "I've seen prey do as you do. Keep to the edges. Avoid the strong. But you're supposed to be warriors, aren't you?" There was a moment of silence before Nolan finally gave a smirk, not hostile, not mocking, just amused. "You don't seem to know much about us." Garval's claws flexed unconsciously against the armrest. That reply shouldn't have bothered him, but it did. It was the tone, calm, assured, like the human was already in on a joke no one else understood. The Zoloth seated in the middle clicked in amusement at the exchange, but no one else spoke. The Drari simply watched, silent and immobile as ever. They weren't a talkative species to begin with, but they knew when something interesting was unfolding. And this was interesting. There was a tension here, quiet but unmistakable, an unspoken challenge wrapped in an innocent question. Garval turned back around and stared forward, but his mind was restless. He could feel the humans behind him. It wasn't just that they were different. It was that they didn't act like they needed to prove themselves, and that was dangerous. He wasn't the only one who noticed either. Over the years, whispers had circulated about human combat units, how they deployed differently, how they always seemed to know when things were about to go sideways. There were rumors that humans didn't just react to chaos, They expected it. Some even claimed they thrived in it. But those were just stories, weren't they? Every species had legends. Every warrior had tales they'd heard in dark bars or long deployments. Most were exaggerations, ghost stories passed around like cautionary tales. Still, Garval kept thinking about what Nolan said. Just habit. What kind of habit put you at the back of the formation every time? In Vira culture, that was where the expendables went. Scouts, technicians, medics. No warrior worthy of the title would choose to sit at the rear. He glanced back one more time, catching just the edge of Nolan's expression as the human whispered something to one of his men. Calm, focused. Not the face of someone scared, not even the face of someone bored, just patient. Garval didn't know it then, but that moment, his assumption about fear would be the last time he ever underestimated a human. The truth is, in most advanced species within the Galactic Concord, where you sit, whether in transports, conferences, or war formations, says something fundamental about who you are. The Virak, for instance, structure their society around combat hierarchy. Frontline placement is earned, not given. It signifies dominance, confidence, readiness to die first. The Drari, more cautious by nature, prefer the middle, strong enough to push forward, safe enough to pull back. The Zoloth, being natural strategists, often position themselves based on tactical advantage, but even they subconsciously associate forward placement with strength. Humans flipped the whole script. They sat in the back. They chose it repeatedly. And at first, no one knew what to make of that. Was it humility? Inexperience? Were they just deferring to older, more established species? But over time, patterns started to emerge. The humans weren't just casually in the back, they were strategically there. They always had line of sight to the entire group, always had clear exits, always waited, watched, and when things went bad, as they inevitably did in galactic politics, those humans at the back were always the first to act. Not the first to panic, not the first to run, the first to act. That made people uncomfortable, because in a society where everyone measured strength by how loud, how fast, or how bold you were, it was deeply unsettling to meet someone who didn't need to show strength at all. They just were. Garval, for all his experience, couldn't admit that not yet, not when all he had to go on were rumors and posture. But deep down, in some quiet place he wouldn't name, he'd started to suspect that maybe, just maybe, the humans weren't afraid of the front. Maybe they just didn't need it, because the strongest position in the room wasn't always the one with the best view. Sometimes it was the one where you saw everything, and no one saw more than the ones who waited in the back. The docking bay looked quiet, too quiet. The transport had slowed with a faint hum as it pulled into position at the Central Orbital Station, a massive structure suspended in neutral space, meant to be a symbol of unity among the major galactic powers. A floating embassy, really. Political summits happened there, disputes were resolved, armistices signed. It was supposed to be a place of peace, but as soon as the transport doors hissed open, Garval's instincts flared. Something didn't feel right. Fluorescent strips blinked erratically, throwing long shadows across the landing floor. No dock workers, no welcoming party, no activity at all. The silence was thick, pressing against the ears like deep water. Even the usual distant hum of the station's energy grid seemed to have dulled into an unnatural stillness. Garval stood quickly, every muscle in his thick, reptilian frame tensing. "Something's wrong," he growled. The other Varric warriors were already rising, trained for this. Their claws flexed, scanning the environment. Behind them, the Drari grunted in agreement. Even the Zoloth, usually so aloof and calculated, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, antennae twitching. And in the back, silence. Garval didn't turn around, but he knew the humans were still sitting there. He didn't need to check. They hadn't said a word since Nolan's cryptic response earlier. That silence wasn't fear, at least not the kind he was used to seeing. It felt more like restraint. Then came the first sound, metal twisting. Somewhere out in the bay, a high-pitched screech rang out as if the entire structure was groaning under sudden pressure. It was followed by a low thud, and then another. Then everything exploded into chaos. The first blast hit just outside the transport. A fiery shockwave slammed into the side of the ship, hurling even the strongest warriors forward. Seats were ripped from the floor. Reinforced panels buckled. Garval was thrown like a rag doll, his armored shoulder smashing into the far wall with a crunch. Pain flared in his chest. He tasted blood. The second blast ripped through the starboard side. Steel and glass shattered inward. The pressure equalized instantly with a shriek of decompression. Debris flew everywhere. Screams echoed deep, guttural cries of Verac, the wet rasp of injured Dreri, the clicking panic of the Zoloth. The transport was no longer a vehicle. It was a coffin spinning through smoke and fire. Instinct took over. Garval scrambled up, blood dripping from his forehead. His claws found the edge of a torn support beam. He hauled himself upright, vision swimming, an ambush. The thought barely had time to register when the attackers came. They weren't common pirates. That much was clear in the first few seconds. These weren't the desperate scavengers who usually preyed on border systems. These enemies were trained, coordinated. They moved in squads, wore high-impact armor, and carried weapons far too advanced for freelancers. Plasma rifles screamed through the broken side of the transport, cutting down Drari warriors where they stood. One of the Zoloth tried to retreat, was hit mid-motion, and collapsed in a tangle of limbs. The Verac fought back, roaring. Garval surged forward, claws slashing. He took one attacker in the chest, ripping through armor like paper. Another turned his way too late, and Garval gutted him with a single strike. Still, they were being overwhelmed. Too many, too fast. He turned to rally his brothers, but froze. The humans were gone, not just Nolan. All of them. Every single one of the humans who'd been sitting so casually in the back moments ago had vanished. Garval scanned the smoke-choked interior, eyes darting for movement. Nothing. No figures. No shadows. No shadows. The rear of the transport was empty. No seats displaced. No signs of struggle. Just gone. It was like they had melted into the air. Another explosion outside rocked the deck, throwing more bodies across the bay. The lights finally died completely, plunging everything into pitch black. And then movement. Not the blundering chaos of the attackers. No, this movement was precise, fluid, a whisper of fabric, a breath of motion. A quick, quiet shift in the shadows. A scream cut through the dark, short and sharp. Then silence. Something slicing through air. Another scream, then again silence. The attackers' momentum slowed. Confusion rippled through their ranks. They had stormed the transport with overwhelming firepower, but now, in the blackness, they were dying. One by one. No warning. No gunfire. Just silence, followed by thuds as armored bodies hit the floor. Garval crouched, claws drawn, senses on full alert. He tried to identify the pattern, but there wasn't one. It was too fast, too deliberate. He knew the Verac hadn't done this. They were loud, brutal fighters. The Drari couldn't have done it either. Not in the dark, not with such finesse. And the Zoloth were injured, retreating to cover. That left only one explanation. Humans. The emergency lighting finally flickered on a dull red glow, bathing the bay like an open wound. Garval blinked, adjusting to the new illumination. And there they were, near the far end of the docking bay, untouched by the blood and fire, stood Sergeant Nolan and his men. Not a scratch on them. Their weapons were holstered, their uniforms clean. their boots still dry. They hadn't even broken formation. They looked like they had just stepped off a shuttle, ready for a casual debriefing, not like they'd been inside a war zone. All around them, the attackers lay sprawled, dozens of them, lifeless, their weapons untouched, their armor intact, but their bodies motionless, silent. Garval's heart pounded. He stood slowly, wincing, as his ribs flared in pain. The remaining Varrock warriors gathered behind him, weapons drawn, but none of them dared approach the humans. Nolan looked up, meeting Garval's gaze. There was no pride in his face, no anger, no celebration, just stillness. Garval finally stepped forward, his voice low, strained. "What did you do?" Nolan didn't move at first. Then he spoke, calm and quiet. "We sat in the back." Garval stared, unblinking. "That's not an answer." Nolan tilted his head. "It's the only one you need." The tension in the docking bay didn't break. Even with the immediate threat gone, no one relaxed. Not the Varrock, not the Drati, not the Zoloth. They all stood frozen, stunned. Everyone had seen the same thing, an ambush of devastating power crushed without warning, without noise, and without any of the humans lifting their weapons. No one could explain it. No one dared try. The air still smelled of scorched metal, plasma, and ozone. Smoke curled along the floor. Debris clinked as it settled, but the silence was thicker than ever. A new alarm sounded in the corridor beyond lower pitch this time, and closer. Boots thundered against the deck plates. Reinforcements. Another wave of hostiles inbound. The remaining defenders, the Varrock, the Drari, the Zoloth, grabbed their weapons again. But now, something had changed. Their confidence was shaken. They had always believed themselves to be the strongest fighters in the galaxy. The Varrock for their strength, the Drari for their endurance, the Zoloth for their tactical brilliance. But none of their skills had saved them in the first strike. Only the humans had moved fast enough, or rather moved at all, and not with desperation, not with brute force, with silence, with calculation. Garval's claws twitched as he stepped beside Nolan. The human hadn't even broken stride. He was already walking forward, calm, steady, like this had all been part of the plan. "You knew," Garval said under his breath. Nolan didn't look at him. "Of course we knew." "Then why didn't you stop them earlier? Why did you wait?" This time, Nolan did stop. He turned slowly, his gaze level and unreadable. "Because we don't fight fair," he said. "We don't fight for honor, or dominance, or any of that crap you cling to." Garval opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Nolan's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "We fight to win." That was the moment everything shifted for Garval. The war, the mission, the battle, the politics, it all fell away. What was left was truth. Uncomfortable, raw, inescapable truth. Humans didn't act like warriors because they weren't. They were something else entirely. Something that waited, watched, calculated. And when they moved, when they chose to move, they didn't just win, they ended things. Fast, quiet, permanently. The smell of plasma still lingered in the air long after the attackers had been killed. The docking bay, once pristine and symmetrical, now looked like a graveyard. Smoke drifted lazily toward the high ceiling, and the emergency lights glowed faint red across scorched metal and fallen bodies. No one spoke. Garval stood just beyond the ruins of the transport, breathing heavily through bruised lungs, his claws twitching at his sides. Around him, other Virak warriors slowly gathered, battered but alive. Some leaned on scorched weapons, others limped, bleeding but upright. The Drari stood quietly nearby, their thick armor blackened in places, dents and scorch marks, making them look less like soldiers and more like survivors of a natural disaster. The Zoloth clung to shadowed corners, twitching nervously. their multiple limbs clacking together in tension. But the humans' gods above the humans looked untouched. There they stood, not far from where the last bodies had fallen, their formation loose but deliberate. Nolan was at the front of their small group, shoulders relaxed, arms folded behind his back. The rest of his team fanned out with eerie calmness. They hadn't drawn their weapons, not once, and yet they stood amidst a sea of corpses, unmarked by the chaos that had consumed everyone else. Garval couldn't look away. He'd seen battles before, fought more than he could count. He'd stood against warlords, charged headlong into fortified bunkers, survived orbital bombardments that should have vaporized his platoon. But he had never seen anything like this. He stepped forward, still trying to piece it together. You didn't shoot." Nolan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The bodies on the floor were answer enough. "How did you?" "We were already moving before they landed," one of Nolan's men said, adjusting a strap on his gear. Garval blinked. "What?" The human glanced at him, his voice even. "We saw the signs. Power fluctuation, dock crew absent. Timing was too perfect. We knew something was coming." "You didn't warn anyone?" "No," Nolan said, his voice low. "We didn't." Garval's breath caught in his throat. That wasn't just bold, it was reckless. Or it would have been if they had lost. But they hadn't. And now, that unsettling calm surrounded them again, like they were standing in a clearing after a storm. "You waited until they hit," Garval said. "We waited until we could see all of them," Nolan replied. Garval stared. "That's madness. That's strategy." It was quiet for a moment. Then Garval lowered his voice, almost growling. "That wasn't fighting. That was killing." Nolan finished. Quickly, quietly, precisely. There was no pride in his tone, no gloating, just truth. And that chilled Garval more than anything. The remaining Verac, Drari, and Zoloth survivors began to regroup in the bay. A few worked to recover weapons from the dead. Others simply stood around the edges, watching the humans with newfound caution. No one said what they were thinking, but the silence was thick with it. How had the humans moved through the battlefield unnoticed? How had they taken down dozens of trained attackers without anyone seeing them lift a finger? The answer was simple. They had trained for it. Garval had spent most of his adult life drilling for combat endurance runs, blade sparring, heavy weapon training. Verac warriors prided themselves on toughness, ferocity, dominance. They charged into battle with roars and plasma cannons, their armor clashing like thunder. That was how a warrior proved himself. But these humans, they didn't roar. They didn't draw blades just to show off their readiness. They didn't posture or shout or beat their chests. They didn't need to. They disappeared into the battlefield like ghosts, like professionals. What struck Garval the most wasn't just how the humans had moved, it was when. They hadn't reacted in panic. They hadn't fired wildly or rushed the enemy in a burst of adrenaline. They had waited, studied, then moved only when the moment was perfect, not a second before. It was discipline he'd never seen in action before, not like this. He thought of the attacker whose throat had been slit cleanly without a sound, the one who had collapsed, face first, without even knowing what hit him. That wasn't the work of brute strength. That was the work of a surgeon. Garval turned to Nolan again. "What kind of training do you give your soldiers?" Nolan's head tilted slightly. "The kind that prepares them to win." "That doesn't tell me anything. It tells you everything." Garval clenched his jaw. He wanted to yell, wanted to demand answers. But deep down, he already understood what was happening here. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were operatives, specialists, ghosts in military uniforms. And they had done what no Verac ever would. They had waited, watched, and executed with surgical precision. Not because they were afraid, but because they knew they didn't need to act until it was necessary. And once they moved, the fight was already over. The second wave came 20 minutes later. No one was caught off guard this time. The alarms had been triggered, and the group, what was left of them, had taken up defensive positions just inside the bay entrance. The Varrock formed a shield line, claws ready, while the Drari positioned themselves as anchors behind bulkheads, their armor braced for impact. The Zoloth fanned out in elevated perches, prepared to coordinate fire. But even as they all took their stances, eyes kept flicking backward to the humans, the same humans who now stood again near the rear, casually checking their weapons, which still had not been drawn. There was no fear in their eyes, no fire in their expressions. They looked calm, too calm. Then the bay doors exploded inward. A new enemy force charged through the breach, better equipped, better trained. Heavier armor, tactical formation, no hesitation. They didn't yell or posture. They were soldiers, not thugs. Mercenaries or contractors, maybe even government-funded. These weren't the amateurs from the first wave. The battle began with a roar of weapons fire. Plasma bolts lit up the chamber, slicing through the air like electric claws. Varrock soldiers charged. Drari shields deflected the worst of it. The Zoloth struck from the flanks, picking targets and coordinating counterfire. But the humans, they moved like water. Nolan didn't issue orders. He didn't need to, his team knew. One of them ducked low, sidestepping a plasma round with barely an inch to spare. Another sprinted forward at an impossible angle, taking cover behind a crate before the enemy could even register the movement. A third didn't take cover at all. He advanced straight through the chaos, moving so quickly and fluidly that his enemies barely had time to target him. Every movement was purposeful, not a single wasted motion, no pause, no panic. It was like watching a choreographed dance. Garval, who had instinctively pushed forward to engage hand-to-hand, found himself stumbling to a halt. The humans were already there, not just physically, but ahead of the enemy. One by one, the hostiles fell. Silent takedowns, controlled bursts of gunfire. One was disarmed mid-step and shot twice in the chest before hitting the floor. Another was taken from behind, his neck twisted with terrifying ease. A turret began to swivel toward the center, then exploded before it could fire a shot. And still none of the humans raised their voices. They moved through the enemy like a storm, not with anger or fury, but with cold inevitability. By the time the Varrock and Drari regrouped at the center of the bay, panting, bleeding, armor cracked and burned, the humans were already done. The fight was over. Just like that. Garval couldn't speak. He couldn't even bring himself to lower his claws. Nolan holstered his weapon. It was the first time Garval had seen it drawn, and he wasn't even sure it had fired. "You knew," Garval said again, hoarse. Nolan looked at him, that same calm expression on his face. "Of course we knew." Garval clenched his fists. "Then why wait? Why let us bleed first?" Nolan didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the battlefield, calm as always. Then he turned, voice quiet. "Because when we fight, we don't just fight to survive. We fight to finish it. Completely, permanently. And when that moment comes, it has to be the right moment." Garval stared at him. For once, he didn't know what to say. "You think war is about honor," Nolan continued. "About showing strength, claiming ground, earning titles." He shook his head. "For us, it's just about ending the threat. Efficiently, quietly, no wasted energy, no glory." That cut deeper than any blade ever had, because it was true. As the group advanced toward the next corridor, toward the heart of the station, where more resistance surely waited, the humans once again took their place at the back. But this time, no one mistook it for weakness. Garval kept glancing over his shoulder, watching the way they moved, the way they checked corners without looking obvious, the way they never seemed surprised. And suddenly, it all made sense. They didn't sit at the back because they were afraid. They sat there because from that position, they could see everything. And when the chaos came, they'd already mapped the battlefield in their heads. That wasn't cowardice. That was control. Garvel had fought all his life with one belief burned into his soul. Strength meant standing your ground. Power came from being first in, last out. For his people, the Verak, that was the code, the creed, the essence of what made a warrior worthy of his name. You fought with tooth and claw, with sweat and fury. You made your presence known. You earned respect by facing the fire, not avoiding it. But after what he saw in the docking bay that day, that belief cracked. Not in a dramatic way, not like a temple crumbling under siege. No, it was quieter, more dangerous, like a fault line splitting under your feet without warning. That quiet was worse, because Garvel had always measured warriors by how loudly they entered the fight, and the humans, those quiet, watchful humans in the back, had rewritten that definition in front of his eyes, and they hadn't even tried to. After the second wave of hostiles was eliminated swiftly and brutally, the survivors regrouped in a corridor just beyond the docking bay. The once proud formation of the galaxy's strongest warriors now looked fractured. The Drari leaned against the walls, clutching their sides as the pain caught up to them. Their heavy breathing echoed through the corridor. The Zoloth had stopped clicking their chatter. The Verak, silent and stone-faced, gripped their weapons tighter than ever, not from readiness, but from uncertainty. The humans? Still in the back, calm, composed, Nolan checked his team with a quick glance. No need for words. Every member knew what was next. They didn't clamor for orders, didn't boast about their kills. They moved with the same eerie fluidity they had shown in the fight, focused, tuned in. It was unnatural. No, that wasn't the right word. It was perfect. Garvel had trained with thousands of Verak over the years. Some were fast, some brutal. Others carried enough firepower to punch holes through ships. But even in the best units, there were always flaws: impatience, ego, miscalculation. It was part of what made warriors real. But the humans? They moved like machines, built to adapt in real time. Only they weren't machines. That's what made it so terrifying. Garvel walked alongside Nolan now, unable to ignore the quiet power the man radiated. No glow, no aura, just certainty. You fought like it was already over, Garvel muttered. Nolan raised a brow. Wasn't it? Garvel stopped walking. That's not how this works. It's how we work, Nolan replied, not even slowing. Garvel stared at the back of his head, trying to put the pieces together. The humans hadn't just been efficient, they had controlled the battlefield. They had acted only when necessary. No wasted motion, no panic. And when the fight came to them, they ended it in seconds, as if they knew exactly where each enemy would move. As if they'd seen it already. He hated how right it felt. That kind of fighting didn't come from instinct. It came from understanding war on a level most species never reached. Later, as they advanced toward the deeper levels of the station, the corridor opened into a large room, lined with burnt-out consoles and shattered holoscreens. The walls were scarred from previous firefights, charred impact points, bloodstains, and the occasional collapsed ceiling panel. Once a control room, now a battleground. The team moved in formation, Verak in the front, Drari behind them, Zoloth on the flanks. Humans, as always, at the rear. But something had changed. Now, every species kept glancing backward, toward the humans. Before the battle, the others had barely acknowledged the humans' presence. They were strange, yes, unpredictable, yes, but mostly ignored. Now, every move they made drew eyes. Every step, every glance, every whispered breath between Nolan's team triggered subtle shifts in the formation. No one said it aloud, but the message was clear. Watch the humans. Follow the humans. Garvel felt it too. Every time they entered a new room, he found himself calculating his distance from Nolan. He didn't trust it yet, not completely, but his instincts were slowly aligning with a new truth. Where the humans moved, Safety followed. Where they stood, enemies fell. They reached a service tunnel where more resistance waited. The enemy had holed up with makeshift barricades and heavy emplacements. It should have been a difficult engagement. It wasn't. Not because the defenders were weak. They weren't. They were disciplined, armored, and positioned well. But the humans made them irrelevant. They didn't lead the charge, didn't draw fire. They simply slipped through the chaos. One by one, Nolan's team cut down the enemy with terrifying calm. Not a single wasted shot, not a single miss. They didn't run. They moved like they'd already walked the path before. It was like watching dancers who had memorized the choreography while everyone else struggled with the first step. By the time the Drari and Varrock reached the last barricade, there were no enemies left, again. Garvel lowered his claws slowly. It was happening again. The humans had ended the fight before it began, and that's when the true weight of it settled on him. It wasn't just that the humans were better trained. It wasn't their tech. Wasn't luck. Wasn't even experience. It was intention. Everything they did was intentional, measured, controlled. They didn't fight like beasts or strategists or zealots. They fought like survivors who had seen the worst and come through it forged in something colder than war. Garval had heard once that humans came from a death world, a planet so hostile, even its air could turn on you. A place where survival was a daily battle against weather, animals, even each other. He hadn't believed it at the time. Now he saw it in their eyes. When they finally reached moment's pause, a brief break in the conflict, Garval pulled Nolan aside near the bulkhead entrance of a sealed corridor. "You don't fight like us," Garval said flatly. Nolan gave a half smile. "No, we don't. You don't. You don't gloat. You don't even care about the win." "We care," Nolan replied. "We just define it differently." Garvel folded his arms, muscles still taut. "Then what is it you care about?" Nolan's answer came without hesitation. "Survival." Garvel waited for more. When none came, he pressed, "That's it. That's everything." And it hit Garvel harder than he expected. Because he knew what it meant. The Varrock fought for glory. Every charge, every victory, every death, it was all part of the story they left behind. Their children sang songs of their battles. Their names were etched into stone. Honor was sacred. The Drari fought for dominance. Their society was a ladder, and every kill moved you up. You earned your rank through blood, through battle, through pain. The Zoloth, they fought for knowledge, strategy, precision. They turned war into mathematics, believing every move could be anticipated, calculated, solved. But the humans? They didn't fight for any of that. They fought to end the fight, with the least cost, the fewest words, the sharpest actions. And when it was over, they didn't boast. They moved on. That was what unnerved Garval the most. Because in every other species he'd met, war left something behind, a trail of broken pride, stories, legends, scars. But with humans, there was only silence. After the final control room was secured and the last defenders had been neutralized again, mostly by the humans, the surviving warriors regrouped. The corridor was dimly lit, flickering with dying power cells. Smoke drifted through the hall. The scent of ozone and ash filled the air, and no one spoke. The Varrock warriors, who once roared their victories in triumph, stood quiet. The Drari had stopped measuring their kills. The Zoloth didn't even bother recording tactics anymore. All eyes were on the humans. Not in anger, not in jealousy, in awe, because for the first time, they understood. This wasn't about weapons or armor. This was about mindset. The humans had stepped onto a battlefield dominated by pride and torn it apart with precision. And not once had they tried to prove themselves. They didn't need to. Garval sat alone in the corner of the corridor, just outside the control room, his body sore but intact. He could hear Nolan giving brief instructions to his team, not barking, just speaking. Like he'd done this 1,000 times. He probably had. Garvel stared at the floor, blood smeared across the plating. He wasn't sure if it was his or not. He didn't care. All he could think about was how wrong he'd been. All these years, he'd believed that power meant standing in front. That leadership came from showing your face. That courage was loud, and victory was something you shouted about. But Nolan had said nothing. The humans had ended the fight before it began and faded back into position as if nothing happened. They didn't fight like warriors. They fought like inevitability, and no one in the galaxy had an answer for that. The war was over. At least, this mission was. The station had been cleared, every threat neutralized, every corridor swept clean. The last body had hit the floor over 20 minutes ago. The final shot had echoed off the metal walls and then faded into silence. But for Garval, the silence hadn't brought peace. It had brought questions. He sat in the transport that would carry them back to the Concord fleet, eyes fixed on the opposite wall, still stained with plasma burns from the initial attack. Around him, Virak warriors shifted in their seats, exhausted, wounded, some in shock. The Drari leaned heavily in their reinforced frames, silent as ever but visibly shaken. The Zoloth fidgeted with their limbs, their eyes dull with mental overload, and in the back, the humans sat like they had from the beginning, quiet, collected, completely in control. Not one of them had spoken more than a few words since the final breach. There was no debrief, no celebratory commentary, no high fives or exchanged looks of pride. They just sat, as if nothing had happened, as if none of it mattered. Garval had seen warriors react to battle in every way imaginable. Some raged, some cried, some laughed with the madness of survival. But this was different. This was the behavior of people for whom battle wasn't a disruption, it was routine. That scared him more than anything. He waited until the transport was halfway through the hyperspace, jumped back to the fleet. Then he stood, still stiff from his injuries, and made his way to the rear. The humans looked up, not startled, not defensive, just observant, as always. Nolan nodded slightly, wordless, giving him permission to approach without saying it. Garval stopped a few feet away. He was used to towering over other species, but with Nolan, that didn't seem to matter. The man didn't shrink back, didn't flinch. His calm didn't come from physicality, it came from something deeper. A place Garval had never learned to name. "I want to ask you something," Garval said. Nolan gave a half shrug. "Go ahead." Garval looked around at the other humans sitting casually, at the red-splattered boots, the untouched uniforms, and then back at the man in front of him. "Why do you always sit in the back?" It wasn't an accusation this time. It wasn't layered with contempt or mockery. This time, it was genuine. Nolan looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. Not smugly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "Because that's where the survivors are," he said. And just like that, the entire war made sense. Garvel sat down across from him, uninvited but unopposed. "That's not a saying where I'm from." "It is where we're from," Nolan replied. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, like he was about to tell a story he carried for ye. Maybe he was. Back home on Earth, survival isn't guaranteed, never has been. Not for most of our history. Our planet isn't gentle, it doesn't care about us. Storms wipe out cities. Earthquakes swallow towns. Wild animals kill without warning. Disease, famine, drought. War. He paused. We've fought wars longer than some species have had agriculture. Garval frowned. "So, you sit at the back because your planet made you afraid?" Nolan didn't react, didn't get angry. He just shook his head. "No, we sit at the back because our planet taught us when to move." He looked Garval dead in the eyes. "Sometimes you charge first, sometimes you wait. But you never stand where the first strike lands unless you're ready to die. Garval leaned back slightly, letting the words sink in. His people, the Varric, were taught from birth that bravery meant being first. You stepped forward, you took the hit, you led the charge and proved your strength. That was how a warrior earned glory. But humans, they didn't fight for glory, they fought for tomorrow. That was it. Every decision Nolan's team had made since the moment they boarded the transport had been shaped by one core truth. Surviving meant being smart, not showy. It meant reading the battlefield before it read you. It meant knowing when not to be seen. Garval had laughed at their calm, their slouching, their stillness. Now he understood. It was all part of the plan. "I used to think you were cowards," Garval admitted. Nolan didn't look surprised. Most people do, at first. "You didn't deny it. What's the point?" Nolan asked. "We don't waste time on pride. We spend it staying alive." Another human across the aisle snorted. "He says that now. You should have seen him back in recon school. Guy tried to outrun a bomb drum. That was a dumb day." Nolan rolled his eyes. "It worked, didn't it?" "Barely," Garval blinked. "You were trained to run toward bombs." "No, the other man replied. "He just does stupid things when he's young. We all do, but we learned," Nolan added. "We adapted. That's what humans do best. We mess up, we survive anyway. Then we do it better next time." Garval studied them again, this small group of soldiers who had upended everything he believed about combat. They weren't massive. They weren't armored like tanks or bristling with firepower. Hell, most of them looked like they could vanish into a crowd with no effort. But that was the point, wasn't it? They survived because they weren't predictable, because they didn't stand where you expected, because they didn't announce themselves. "We're not the strongest," Nolan said, as if reading Garval's mind. "Not physically, not technologically. But we're the ones who crawl out of the rubble after everyone else has stopped breathing." Garval let out a long breath. He'd seen the aftermath of the initial explosion. The Varric had been thrown like dolls. The Drari had been too slow to react. Even the Zoloth had been caught in the chaos. But the humans? They were gone before the blast finished echoing. They hadn't reacted. They'd anticipated. "You saw it coming," Garval said. Nolan nodded. "We didn't know what exactly, but the signs were there, and you didn't warn us. That would have made us a target. Or panicked everyone, or triggered the ambush early." Garval's brow furrowed. "You let us bleed." "No," Nolan replied calmly. "We let the enemy expose themselves. If we'd moved too early, they'd have vanished, or regrouped. You don't cut the snake's head unless you know where it is." "And the others? The rest of the galaxy?" Garval asked. "They don't see it like that." "No," Nolan agreed. "But now they will." Garval stared at the floor. For centuries, the Varric had stood at the front. Their warriors had led charges across 1,000 battlefields. They had been admired, feared, respected. They believed they were the tip of the spear, the cutting edge of war. But they weren't, not really. They were the blade. And humans were the hand that chose when to strike. That was the difference. The transport hummed softly as it approached the Concord fleet. Outside the windows, ships floated in neat formation. Clean, efficient, deadly. Garval glanced back at the other warriors, his people. Some still bore the fire in their eyes, but others looked like he felt. Unsure, off balance, quietly shaken. "I don't know how to tell them," Garval muttered. Nolan leaned forward slightly. "Tell them the truth, that we've been fighting wrong, that you've been fighting loud," Nolan said. "Sometimes loud wins. Sometimes it doesn't." Garval shook his head. "We've built our entire society around the idea that standing tall in the front proves your worth." Nolan nodded. "And how many of your best died doing it?" Garval flinched. The words weren't cruel. They were just accurate. "I've lost more brothers than I can count," Garval admitted. "I thought they died gloriously." "They probably did," Nolan said. "But that doesn't mean they had to. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of the transport the only sound between them. Finally, Garvel spoke again. You know, if you ever led a battle from the front, the rest of the galaxy would finally take your strength seriously. But then we'd be dead. And there it was. The truth no one wanted to admit. The humans didn't sit in the back because they were lesser. They sat there because they intended to live. And living, no matter how it looked, was the ultimate victory. Garvel had faced death more times than he could count. He'd walked away from collapsed trenches, crawled out of wrecked gunships, survived point-blank detonations that turned entire squads to ash. He had seen what battle could do to the body, to the mind, to the soul, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had shaken him like what he'd seen on that station. Not the fire, not the enemy, the humans. They hadn't just fought differently, they'd changed the rules, and now, the entire galaxy had to deal with that truth. When the survivors returned to their respective fleets, there was no victory parade, no songs of triumph, no grand feast or roaring speeches. The docking bays were somber, the debriefing chambers were tense. The warriors who had witnessed what happened aboard the station walked with heavy steps and guarded eyes. The Virak, once loud and proud, now moved like shadows. The Drari, stoic even in the best of times, said nothing at all. The Zoloth, ever analytic, replayed the battle footage again and again, but could not find the logic they relied on. The humans? They simply disembarked and returned to their quarters, quiet, efficient, unchanged. It was as if they hadn't just shattered the strongest forces in the galaxy's arsenal with nothing more than timing, silence, and a few precise strikes. Garvel had watched them go without a word. Nolan hadn't turned to say goodbye, hadn't looked back. He didn't have to. The message had already been delivered, loud and clear. In the weeks that followed, war councils across dozens of systems held emergency sessions. The Virak High Command summoned Garvel personally. He was still in recovery when the request arrived. He didn't even have time to take off his battle-dented armor before stepping into the stone-lit chamber of elders, some of whom had fought in the earliest interstellar conflicts. They had read his report. They had spoken to the Drari. They had reviewed the sensor logs. Now they wanted the truth. "Do you believe humanity is a threat?" the High Chancellor asked, his voice slow and rumbling like distant thunder. Garvel stood tall, but he did not answer right away. He remembered Nolan's words, the stillness in his voice, the absence of arrogance, the efficiency of death delivered without spectacle. He remembered the enemy crumpling before any of the other species had even drawn weapons. He remembered what it felt like to realize that the humans had planned the outcome of the battle before anyone else knew the fight had even begun. Finally, he spoke. "No," Garvel said. The chamber shifted. Murmurs rippled through the room like wind through dead leaves. "They are not a threat," he repeated. "They are a warning." It wasn't just the Virak who were shaken. Across the Concord, the most powerful species began rethinking everything. The Drari debated their ancient doctrine of brute force. Their strongest champions had fallen before they even landed a blow. The Zoloth, whose entire military system relied on predictive modeling and probability, found themselves unable to account for the unpredictability of human combat. The models couldn't keep up. The patterns broke down. The math failed. The consensus was undeniable. Humans hadn't defeated their enemies. They had outlived them, and that was something far more dangerous than power. Garvel sat alone in his quarters late one cycle, replaying the battle logs for the 100th time. He focused not on the fights, but on the moments before the fights, how the humans stood still, how they scanned the area without seeming to, how they timed their strikes to match the enemy's overreach, not their own aggression. He realized something chilling. The humans weren't faster. They were patient, while other species rushed to act, to prove, to dominate. The humans waited. And when they moved to end the fight, not to prolong it, not to show off, not even to win glory, just to survive, just to finish. He received one final message from the Concorde 3 cycles after the mission, a request to speak before an interspecies summit, not as a war hero, as a witness. They didn't want strategies. They didn't want tactics. They wanted an answer. What had they just seen? And Garval, still unsure if he even understood it, fully gave them the only truth he could. They do not fight to win territory. They do not fight for honor or ego. They fight because they know what it costs to lose. That was the difference. Other species fought because they could. Humans fought because they had to, because for most of their history, the alternative had been extinction. At the summit, a Zooth strategist stood up and asked, "Why didn't they take credit for the victory?" Garval didn't hesitate. "Because they were trying to impress us." A Drari general asked, "Why didn't they lead the charge?" "Because they were leading all along. You just didn't notice." Then the Virac chancellor posed the question everyone was afraid to ask. "If they can end a battle before it begins, what happens if we ever fight them?" Garval answered without blinking. "Then we lose before we even know it started." The room went cold. In the months that followed, diplomatic protocols across the galaxy changed. Military doctrine shifted. Entire academies rewrote their training programs. Analysts were deployed to Earth to study human history, psychology, culture, anything that could explain how a species so average in physicality could operate on such a terrifying level in battle. The conclusion was always the same. Humans didn't excel in any one area. They adapted. They watched, they waited, they endured. And when the time came, they ended the threat with cold precision. They didn't look like apex predators, but they had the instincts of one. And now the rest of the galaxy knew it. Real-world reflection. Lessons from fiction in the end. The story of the humans sitting in the back isn't really about war. Not entirely. It's about how we see strength and, more importantly, how we misjudge it. Too often, we
assume the loudest in the room are the strongest. We think leadership is about being at the front, shouting the orders, making the biggest impression. But real strength? Real strategy? It's quiet. It's deliberate. It's the person in the back, watching, learning, waiting for the right moment, not to show off, but to make the difference. In life, as in war, survival often comes down to the ones who think first and act last, not the ones who run in blind. We've all met Garval's people who believe they're strong because they're loud. They push to the front of the line, fight for recognition, mistake aggression for effectiveness. But the Nolans of the world, they don't seek attention. They stay quiet. They prepare. And when chaos breaks out, whether it's a crisis, a conflict, or a turning point, they're the ones who walk out calmly while everyone else is still trying to figure out what just happened. This story reminds us that restraint is not weakness, that patience is not passivity, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who isn't trying to prove anything at all, because they already know who they are. They're not in the front for glory. They're in the back because that's where the survivors are.